Shawn "Diddy" Combs finds himself in a battle for more than just his personal liberty. He is also in a fight to protect his wealth. Forbes recently assessed his net worth at $400 million, a stark decrease from the $740 million valuation he held just a few years prior. But that figure faces the threat of shrinking even further. Federal prosecutors are actively working to seize any assets connected to the purported criminal activity. It's the end of an era. The commanding presence of the bad boy empire has faded, replaced by the solemn proceedings of a courtroom. Shawn "Diddy" Combs hasn't just forfeited millions, he has forfeited his entire position. His immense fortune, which he displayed to the world for 3 decades. Once seen as a billionaire with a portfolio including a vodka line, a television network, and a fashion brand, Shawn Combs' wealth has suffered a severe blow. Forbes places his net worth at approximately $400 million, which is almost half of its value from just a few years ago. His mansions in both Beverly Hills and Miami were subjected to raids in March of 2024 as part of the probe into his alleged criminal conduct. And that number could fall lower still. As Combs confronts a federal trial and a potential forfeiture action from the Justice Department that could strip him of his empire. This is an empire that prosecutors claim was constructed, at least partially, through a consistent pattern of illegal acts encompassing alleged sex trafficking, narcotics distribution, and violence, all allegedly employed to further what they designate as a racketeering enterprise. Within the unsealed indictment, prosecutors detail how his corporate and personal assets were allegedly utilized to execute or hide these crimes. This implies that any asset linked to this behavior, even tangentially, is at risk of seizure, including his real estate, his companies, his vehicles, and his aircraft. Reports indicate his $60 million private jet has already been sold. The Beverly Hills property is now listed for $61 million. And although Combs retains ownership of his $48 million Miami residence, a judge refused his motion to use it as collateral for his bond. During the second week of testimony, Homeland Security Special Agent Gannon testified. Gannon, who was part of the team leading the March raids on Combs' residences, guided the jury through photographs of the seized items. These included components for AR-15-style rifles with their serial numbers filed off, loaded ammunition magazines, a Gucci bag said to contain ketamine and MDMA, and personal effects such as lingerie, along with dozens of bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Prosecutors argue this evidence is vital for proving the necessary components under federal racketeering statutes, assisting them in demonstrating a pattern of purported crime. Illegal conduct used to maintain or disguise the enterprise. In a move to safeguard his remaining assets, Combs has retained Stefan Casella, the former deputy chief of the Justice Department's Asset Forfeiture and Money Laundering section, to combat the forfeiture action. If the jury convicts Combs, it will then be their responsibility to decide the extent of Combs' assets that are subject to seizure. Anything forfeited after a conviction could potentially be used to compensate the alleged victims. Shawn Combs denies every allegation. To help analyze what is truly at stake, legal experts like Jim Trusty, the former chief of the Department of Justice's Organized Crime and Gang section, offer their insights. Trusty confirms that the forfeiture effort appears to be extremely aggressive. He cites 2 primary reasons for this assessment. The first is the very broad wording of the legal filings. They refer to essentially any property, real or personal, that could be classified as either facilitating property, also called instrumentalities, or proceeds. This, Trusty notes, effectively puts the entire business empire of P. Diddy at risk. The second part of this aggressive strategy is the nature of the Rico case itself. The government has defined the criminal enterprise as not just Shawn Combs, the individual, but also all the business interests he holds, including his liquor labels, music labels, and everything else imaginable. They have structured the case in a way that is common for racketeering cases, which aim to tell the complete story of a criminal enterprise rather than focusing on a single crime. This narrative approach lends itself to significant forfeiture actions. Trusty finds it somewhat unusual, however, that the filings are not specific about any preliminary seizures. It appears that despite executing search warrants and gathering evidence, the government has not yet actually seized assets. Often in such cases, there would be a list of bank accounts, vehicles, or jets that the government has preemptively seized to ensure their availability for a potential forfeiture hearing. This case, Trustee observes, is a blank slate. This lack of specificity could be a point of contention. A defense attorney in this situation, upon reaching the forfeiture phase, which would typically involve the same jury, could argue to the judge that they have not been given proper notice due to the overly broad wording. The defense would likely demand that the claims be particularized, allowing them time to process the specifics and potentially bring in expert testimony from both sides to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate sources of income. A key question is how a seemingly legitimate business, like Combs's vodka line, could possibly be entangled in these allegations. Trustee explains this can happen in one of two or even three ways. First, if there's a connection where that business was used to facilitate the alleged crimes, such as the freak-offs mentioned in the indictment or any obstructive acts. For example, if a recording studio owned by one of his companies was used for one of these parties, it could be argued that the studio facilitated or was an instrumentality of the criminal conduct. The second way is if the business is deemed to be proceeds, meaning it was fundamentally built using money derived from illegal activities. The third way, which Trustee notes can become very confusing, is the concept of substitute assets. This is when the government concedes that a specific asset, like a car or artwork, wasn't bought with proceeds or used in the crime, but because they can't find enough other assets to satisfy the total amount they claim they are owed, they seize it as a substitute. Trustee characterizes federal forfeiture as an area of law that is extremely favorable to the government, and he believes they are positioned to potentially seize almost anything Combs has ever touched. As for how the government determines the monetary value they seek, Trustee notes that this case is more complex than others. In a fraud case, one could simply add up the amount of victimization to reach a total. In a drug case, one could calculate the street value of the narcotics involved. Here, it is much more open-wide. Trustee anticipates a trial within a trial if the case reaches the forfeiture phase. This would involve defense experts arguing that certain money is clean and untouched by any criminal enterprise, countered by FBI forensic auditors arguing why the government is entitled to all specified proceeds or instruments. It is, he says, an open battlefield and a textbook example of how deep the government might try to reach. The question of when such a strategy becomes legally risky for prosecutors is also relevant. The court of public opinion, Trustee points out, does occasionally turn against forfeiture. The principle behind it is sound, to prevent individuals from profiting from crime, not just being punished for it. However, abuses are seen over time, such as when a person with a minimal role in a conspiracy is ordered to forfeit millions, leading to Supreme Court challenges over fairness. While Trustee doesn't believe Combs would gin up much public sympathy if convicted, legal observers might still view an attempt to seize every penny from someone who also had legitimate income for decades as a broad overreach. Prosecutors would likely justify their actions on two fronts. First, they would argue that they have not financially disabled Combs pre-trial. They haven't frozen his accounts in a way that would prevent him from hiring attorneys or experts. And second, they would point to the nature of the charge, a criminal enterprise spanning many years from which Combs allegedly derived financial profit through power and control. Trustee does not expect prosecutors to be apologetic, though they might show moderation later by choosing not to pursue certain companies. For now, they have left all options on the table. Combs's recent actions, such as selling a jet and listing his $61 million Beverly Hills mansion, are noted. Trustee doubts this would be admissible during the main trial, but suggests it could come up in the forfeiture phase to show his overall financial stock has dropped, though he jokes that Combs is down to his last $400 million. Ultimately, Trustee believes no firm conclusions can be drawn from these sales. Combs knows he is in the battle of his life, facing a life-eligible racketeering case. If the alleged facts of abuse and control are established, it paints a dark picture for his sentencing. In response, Combs has hired Stefan Casella, who Trustee identifies as the literal expert on asset forfeiture, someone he himself calls for advice. Trustee calls him a fantastic pick who understands both the process and the law. He speculates that Casella is preparing the defense for potential challenges and identifying weaknesses in the government's approach. This could include arguments about whether the government is properly discounting Combs's lawful employment, or even complex issues around how Combs is spending money on his legal defense now. Trusty believes Casella is providing sage guidance on navigating this very broad forfeiture. Hiring Casella is seen as a shot across the bow that will certainly give prosecutors a moment of pause. While the prosecution's main focus is likely on securing a conviction, seeing Casella on the other side signals that they will face a formidable and knowledgeable opponent in any forfeiture proceeding. Regarding the concept of facilitating property, Trusty clarifies that the government must show a significant link between the property and the crime. It cannot be a 6 steps removed connection, such as arguing that because a bottle of his liquor brand was at the scene of an assault, the entire liquor company facilitated the crime. The quantum of proof must be deeper. However, it is very fact-specific. This is why Trusty reiterates that the forfeiture phase could become its own mini-trial, delving into Combs's finances and the precise connectivity